Picture this, you're 17 years old, and, while your classmates worry about prom dates and college applications, you've just spent 3 years fighting an intergalactic war that could have ended humanity forever. You've seen entire worlds burn, watched friends die in your arms, and made decisions that saved billions of lives. You've earned scars that tell stories no teenager should know, and medals that weigh heavier than the metal they're made from. Now imagine walking back into your old high school, where the biggest drama is still who's dating whom, where teachers treat you like just another student, and where nobody understands that the quiet girl in the back row has literally held the fate of the galaxy in her hands. This is the story of Sarah Chan, a young woman who left Earth as a frightened 16-year-old volunteer and returned as humanity's youngest war hero. But, coming home from saving the universe? That might be the hardest battle she's ever fought. Because sometimes, the real war begins when the shooting stops. The shuttle touched down on Earth with barely a whisper, its advanced engines making less noise than the morning traffic already building up outside Lincoln High School. Sarah Chan pressed her face against the small porthole, watching the familiar red brick building where she'd spent 2 years of what felt like someone else's life. The autumn leaves were the same golden brown she remembered, but everything else felt impossibly small and distant, like looking at a miniature model of childhood. Final approach to Terra Base 7, announced the pilot, a blue-skinned Valerian whose species had joined the Galactic Alliance just 6 months ago. Lieutenant Chen, you're cleared for standard discharge procedures. Lieutenant. The rank still felt strange on her tongue, even after 3 years of active duty. Sarah touched the silver bars on her collar unconsciously, then caught herself doing it. Another habit she'd have to break. Another piece of her war self that wouldn't fit into the life waiting for her below. The debriefing officer, Commander Rodriguez, appeared in the aisle beside her seat. He was human. Thankfully Sarah had grown tired of translation devices and the subtle delays they created in conversation. After years of split-second tactical communications with 17 different species, sometimes you just wanted to talk to someone who understood sarcasm and could appreciate a good Earth-style curse word. Nervous about going back? Rodriguez asked, settling into the seat across from her. Sarah shrugged, still watching the school grow larger as they descended. Should I be? Most returning veterans have some adjustment period. You're younger than most, and you've been gone longer relative to your age. Plus. He gestured vaguely at her chest, where 3 rows of service ribbons caught the morning light streaming through the porthole. You've seen more action than soldiers twice your age. The medal of galactic heroism sat heavy against her chest, hidden beneath her civilian clothes. She'd earned it during the Battle of Kepler 442b, when she'd held a defensive position for 18 hours against Zephyrian assault troops while evacuating a civilian colony. 200,000 people had made it to safety because she and her squad had refused to retreat. Only she and Corporal Williams had survived to see the rescue ships arrive. Williams was still in the military hospital on Proxima Station, missing both legs and an arm. He'd probably never walk again, but he was alive, and he could still crack jokes about the terrible food in the medical bay. Sarah counted that as a victory, even if the nightmares about that 18-hour stand still woke her up most nights. The important thing to remember, Rodriguez continued, is that civilian life operates on different rules. What seems important to people here might feel trivial to you now. Try to be patient. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure patience had ever been her strong suit. Even before the war, she'd been the kid who asked too many questions, who got bored easily, who always wanted to know what came next. 3 years of active combat hadn't exactly mellowed that tendency. The shuttle settled onto the landing pad with a soft thump. Through the windows, Sarah could see the small crowd that had gathered to meet her. Her parents stood at the front, looking older and grayer than she remembered. Her mother held a small bouquet of flowers, daisies, Sarah's childhood favorite. Her father wore his best suit, the one he usually saved for church and job interviews. Behind them stood Principal Morrison, looking exactly as Sarah remembered him, tall, thin, and perpetually concerned about something. A few teachers she recognized flanked him, along with several students holding a banner that read "Welcome Home Sarah," in glittery letters that caught the morning sun. Your education grant has been approved, Rodriguez said, handing her a data tablet. Full ride to any university in the Alliance, or you can finish high school first if you prefer. Most returning veterans take advantage of accelerated programs, but, given your age, I want to finish high school, Sarah said quickly. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise Rodriguez. Really? With your service record, you could walk into any military academy in the galaxy. Hell, you could probably teach at most of them. Sarah stood up and gathered her small bag of personal belongings. Everything she owned now fit into a single duffel bag, another adjustment she'd have to make. 3 years ago, her bedroom had been cluttered with posters, books, and the accumulated junk of teenage life. Now she could carry everything she cared about in one hand. I missed my junior and senior years, she said. I want to experience them. Rodriguez looked skeptical, but he signed off on her discharge papers without argument. Your psychological evaluation is scheduled for next week. Don't miss it, it's not optional. And, Sarah? He stood up as the shuttle door cycled open. If you need anything at all, you call me. Readjustment is tough for everyone, but it's especially hard for heroes. The word heroes made Sarah's stomach twist. She'd never felt like a hero, just a scared kid doing whatever it took to stay alive and keep her friends breathing. Heroes were supposed to be brave and noble and sure of themselves. Heroes didn't wake up in cold sweats, reliving the moment they'd pulled the trigger on an enemy combatant who turned out to be barely older than they were. Sarah stepped off the shuttle into the crisp October air of Earth. The gravity felt strange after so long in the variable artificial gravity of ships and space stations. Everything felt heavy and immediate and real in a way that made her dizzy. Sarah! Her mother's voice cut through the morning air, and, suddenly, Sarah was wrapped in arms that smelled like home lavender soap and the faint scent of the vanilla candles her mother burned while grading papers. The hug lasted longer than Sarah expected, and she realized her mother was crying. Let me look at you, her father said when her mother finally released her. His voice was thick with emotion he was trying hard to control. You're so tall. And thin. Are they feeding you enough up there? Sarah smiled, though it felt rusty on her face. The food's terrible, but there's plenty of it. How's everything here? How's the restaurant? Her parents owned a small Chinese restaurant downtown. Her father cooked, her mother handled the books and waited tables. It was the kind of small, family business that had defined Sarah's childhood, always busy, never quite profitable enough, but filled with regular customers who felt more like extended family than clientele. Good, her father said, though something in his expression suggested otherwise. We've missed you. The whole neighborhood has been asking about you. Principal Morrison stepped forward, extending his hand with the kind of formal smile he reserved for school board meetings and parent conferences. Sarah, welcome home. We're very proud of what you've accomplished. Sarah shook his hand, noting how soft it felt compared to the calloused grip she was used to. Thank you, sir. I'm looking forward to getting back to normal. Well, we'll do everything we can to make your transition as smooth as possible. Your transcripts from the Alliance Education Corps have been integrated into our system. Academically, you're well ahead of your peer group, but we've arranged for you to complete your senior year with your original class. Sarah nodded, though the idea of sitting through classes on Earth history and basic mathematics felt surreal after 3 years of tactical training and xenobiology studies. She'd learned to pilot 7 different types of spacecraft, speak 4 alien languages, and field strip a plasma rifle in under 30 seconds. She wondered if any of that would be useful in AP chemistry. The group of students with the welcome banner shuffled forward awkwardly. Sarah recognized a few faces, kids who'd been sophomores when she'd left, now seniors themselves. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been awe, like she was a celebrity they'd seen on television but never expected to meet in person. Sarah, hi, said a girl with short red hair and paint-stained fingers. I'm Emma Rodriguez. I don't think we really knew each other before, but I'm student council president now. We've planned a little welcome back assembly for tomorrow, if that's okay? Sarah glanced at her parents, then back at Emma. That's very thoughtful, but I was hoping to just slip back into things quietly. Oh. Emma's face fell slightly. It's just that everyone's really excited to meet you. I mean, you're like, famous. There was an article about you in the Galactic Tribune, And, Mr. Peterson, he teaches current events now. He's been using your service record as an example of human courage in interspecies conflicts. The idea of her military service being discussed in a high school classroom made Sarah's skin crawl. The Battle of Kepler 442b wasn't a lesson plan or a discussion topic. It was the smell of burned ozone and melted plasteel, the weight of a plasma rifle that had been firing for so long it glowed cherry red, the sound Williams made when the Zephyrian energy lance took his legs off at the knees. Maybe we could keep things low-key for now, Sarah said, forcing her voice to stay level. I'm still adjusting to being back. Emma nodded quickly, but Sarah caught the disappointed glances exchanged between the other students. She was already failing at this, and she hadn't even made it through the first day. The ride home passed in a blur of familiar streets that seemed both exactly the same and completely different. Her parents filled the silence with chatter about neighbors and local news, as if the ordinary details of small-town life could bridge the gap that 3 years and a galactic war had created between them. Sarah's childhood bedroom had been preserved exactly as she'd left it. Her posters of boy bands and movie stars stared down at her from walls that suddenly seemed impossibly close together. Her bed looked tiny after years of sleeping in military bunks and ship berths. The whole room felt like a museum exhibit, typical American teenager, circa 2387. She sat on the edge of the bed and tried to remember what it had felt like to be the person who'd lived in this room. That Sarah had worried about algebra tests and whether Jake Morrison would ask her to the winter formal. She'd collected stuffed animals and painted her nails different colors every week. She'd thought the worst thing that could happen was failing a test or being embarrassed in front of her friends. That Sarah had been innocent in a way that could never be recovered. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Sarah? Dinner's ready, her mother called. Dinner was Sarah's favorite from childhood, her grandmother's recipe for orange chicken, served with steamed rice and vegetables from her mother's garden. The flavors were exactly as she remembered, but somehow her taste buds had changed. Everything seemed oversalted and overseasoned after years of bland military rations. So what's school like up there? Her father asked. The Alliance Education Corps, I mean. Sarah pushed rice around on her plate, considering how to explain 3 years of intensive military education to parents who thought college prep was rigorous. Different. More focused on practical applications. We studied xenobiology, interspecies communications, tactical mathematics. Mathematics? Her mother perked up. She'd always handled the numbers for the restaurant. What kind? Trajectory calculations for orbital mechanics. Statistical analysis for resource management. Probability matrices for tactical decision-making. Sarah caught herself slipping into military jargon and tried to course correct. Basically, math you can use to keep people alive in space. Her parents exchanged a look that Sarah couldn't quite interpret. Pride, maybe, mixed with something that might have been concern. And, you made friends? Her mother asked. The other kids in your program? Kids. Sarah almost laughed. Most of her unit had been older than her parents. She'd served alongside a 40-year-old Centauran engineer who had 3 children, a 60-year-old human doctor who'd left a thriving practice to join the war effort, and a 120-year-old Altarian tactician whose species considered him a young hotshot. Some, she said instead. Williams is still recovering from his injuries. Martinez got promoted and transferred to the Andromeda sector. Singh is taking advanced officer training on Rigel Prime. Will you see them again? Her father asked. Sarah shrugged. Maybe. Military friendships are complicated. The truth was that she missed her unit more than she'd expected. They'd shared experiences that no civilian could understand, forged bonds that went deeper than friendship. They'd saved each other's lives, watched each other's backs, trusted each other with secrets that could never be spoken aloud. Here, surrounded by the comfortable familiarity of home, she felt more alone than she had in the cold vacuum of space. After dinner, Sarah helped her mother wash dishes, a ritual that felt both comforting and strange. Her hands remembered the movements, but her reflexes kept expecting the efficient sonic cleaners used on ships. Everything here took longer, required more steps, involved more waste. Your father's worried about you, her mother said quietly, scrubbing a plate with unnecessary vigor. Why? You seem distant. Different. Her mother paused, considering her words. We know you've been through things we can't imagine. We just want you to know that we're here for you, whatever you need. Sarah dried a glass carefully, focusing on the simple task to keep her emotions in check. I know. I'm just tired. It's been a long trip. The guidance counselor at school called yesterday. Mrs. Patterson. She wanted to discuss your transition plan. What kind of plan? Academic catch-up, social integration, college preparation. Normal senior year things. Her mother handed her another glass. She also mentioned that the school has a counselor trained in military readjustment therapy, if you think that might help. The idea of discussing her experiences with a civilian therapist who'd learned about war from textbooks made Sarah want to laugh and scream at the same time. How could she explain what it felt like to make life or death decisions when you're barely old enough to vote? How could she describe the weight of command, the burden of knowing that your choices would determine whether your friends lived or died? I'll think about it, she said instead. That night, Sarah lay in her childhood bed and stared at the ceiling she'd memorized years ago. Every crack and water stain was exactly where she remembered it, but sleep wouldn't come. The silence was wrong. Where were the gentle hums of life support systems, the distant vibrations of engines, the comforting background noise of a ship in space? Earth was too quiet, too still, too safe. She must have dozed eventually, because she woke to the sound of her alarm clock, an actual mechanical alarm clock, not the soft chimes of a ship's computer. The sound was harsh and jarring, nothing like the gentle wake-up call she was used to. Her parents had already left for work by the time she made it downstairs. A note on the refrigerator reminded her that school started at 8 o'clock and wished her luck on her first day back. Her mother had laid out clothes for her, jeans and a sweater that Sarah remembered liking 3 years ago. The clothes still fit, more or less, though 3 years of military conditioning had changed her body in ways that civilian clothing wasn't designed to accommodate. The jeans felt restrictive after years of tactical uniforms designed for movement and utility. The sweater was soft and warm but offered no protection, no pockets for equipment, no reinforcement at stress points. Sarah walked to school, following the same route she'd taken hundreds of times before. The neighborhoods were exactly as she remembered them, but they seemed somehow smaller and less significant. These houses that had once represented the boundaries of her known world now felt like dollhouses, quaint and fragile and utterly disconnected from the vast universe she'd come to know. Lincoln High School buzzed with the familiar energy of teenagers navigating the complex social ecosystem of high school hallways. Students clustered around lockers, rushed to beat the first bell, complained about homework and tests and all the small dramas that had once seemed earth-shatteringly important to Sarah. Now, watching her former peers worry about pop quizzes and relationship drama, she felt like an anthropologist studying a primitive culture. These problems were so small, so manageable, so beautifully insignificant compared to the weight of decisions she'd grown accustomed to making. The guidance counselor's office was exactly as Sarah remembered it, motivational posters about reaching for dreams, college brochures scattered across every available surface, and the faint smell of coffee and adolescent anxiety. Mrs. Patterson looked up from her desk with the kind of bright, determined smile that suggested she'd been preparing for this conversation all morning. Sarah. Welcome back. Please, sit down. How are you feeling about your first day? Sarah settled into the familiar chair across from Mrs. Patterson's desk and tried to remember how to have a normal conversation about normal things. Fine, I think. Still adjusting. That's completely understandable. You've been through an extraordinary experience, and readjusting to civilian life takes time. Mrs. Patterson consulted a thick folder with Sarah's name on the tab. I've reviewed your transcripts from the Alliance Education Corps. Academically, you're quite advanced, your mathematics and science scores are at college level, and your marks in strategic thinking and leadership are exceptional. Sarah nodded, unsure how to respond. The Alliance didn't give grades for the things she'd really learned: how to stay calm when people were shooting at you, how to make impossible decisions with incomplete information, how to keep functioning when everything you believed about right and wrong got blown apart by the realities of war. The challenge, Mrs. Patterson continued, is going to be social integration. You've missed some important developmental experiences, and your peer group has moved on without you. But I think with the right approach, we can help you reconnect with your classmates and enjoy a normal senior year experience. Normal. The word felt foreign on Sarah's tongue. What was normal for someone who'd commanded a mixed species unit in combat? What was normal for someone who'd watched entire civilizations hang in the balance? What was normal for someone who'd killed people in defense of strangers she'd never meet? I've arranged a modified schedule for you, Mrs. Patterson said, sliding a paper across the desk. Advanced placement classes where your skills are strongest, and some electives that might help you reconnect with civilian interests. Art therapy, creative writing, peer counseling. Sarah glanced at the schedule. First period, Advanced Calculus. Second period, AP Physics. Third period, Current Events and Galactic Politics. Fourth period, Art Therapy. Fifth period, English Literature. Sixth period, Physical Education. Physical education? Sarah asked. I know it seems silly given your military training, but it's a graduation requirement. Coach Williams, no relation to your friend, I believe, has agreed to work with you on an independent study program. Maybe you could help with some of the younger students? The idea of teaching high school students basic physical fitness after 3 years of combat training felt surreal, but Sarah nodded anyway. She was beginning to understand that agreeing with adults was going to be an important survival skill in this new old world. The first bell rang, echoing through hallways that suddenly seemed smaller and more crowded than Sarah remembered. Students rushed past the guidance office windows, backpacks bouncing, voices raised in the particular kind of controlled chaos that defined high school between classes. Your first class is just down the hall, Mrs. Patterson said, standing up. Mr. Thompson's Advanced Calculus. He's been looking forward to meeting you. Apparently your Alliance transcript includes some mathematical concepts he's never encountered before. Sarah slung her borrowed backpack over her shoulder and headed toward the door. The backpack felt strange, too light, too soft, designed for carrying textbooks instead of survival gear. Her body kept expecting the familiar weight of tactical equipment, the reassuring presence of weapons and communication devices that had become as natural as her own limbs. Sarah? Mrs. Patterson called as she reached the door. Remember, this is supposed to be fun. You're a teenager, you're home safe, and you have a chance to experience all the things you missed while you were serving. Try to enjoy it. Sarah nodded and stepped into the hallway, into the stream of students hurrying to their next class. She let the crowd carry her toward Advanced Calculus, toward her first step back into the world she'd left behind. But, as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was an actor preparing to play a role she'd forgotten how to perform. The girl who'd lived in this school, who'd navigated these hallways with confidence, who'd belonged here, that person felt like a stranger now. Sarah Chen, high school student, was going to have to learn how to exist all over again. And she wasn't sure the universe had prepared her for that particular challenge. Advanced Calculus turned out to be the easiest part of Sarah's day. Mr. Thompson, a middle-aged man with coffee stains on his shirt and genuinely passionate enthusiasm for mathematics, welcomed her into his classroom with the kind of intellectual curiosity that reminded her of the Alliance research scientists she'd worked with during the war. Miss Chen, he said after she'd introduced herself to the class, I understand you've been studying applied mathematics in some rather unique contexts. Would you mind if we explored some of the concepts from your Alliance transcripts? Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time since arriving on Earth. Mathematics was universal, literally. The same principles that governed orbital mechanics around Earth worked equally well around the triple star system of Kepler-16. Numbers didn't care about politics or trauma or the weight of command decisions. They just were. When Mr. Thompson put a trajectory calculation problem on the board, the kind of equation used to plot course corrections for interplanetary travel, Sarah solved it in her head before most of the other students had finished reading the question. The familiar mental process of working through variables and constants felt like slipping into comfortable clothes after wearing someone else's outfit all day. Impressive, Mr. Thompson said, checking her work. Most college students struggle with multidimensional trajectory analysis. Where did you encounter this type of problem? Navigation training, Sarah said simply. When you're piloting a ship between star systems, you learn to calculate fuel efficiency and time dilation effects pretty quickly. A girl named Jessica, whom Sarah vaguely remembered from middle school, raised her hand. Wait, you actually flew spaceships? Like, by yourself? Mostly as co-pilot, Sarah clarified. But, yeah, I'm certified for 7 different classes of vessels. The classroom erupted in whispered conversations. Sarah caught fragments. So cool, like a movie, I can't even drive a car yet. She realized that her classmates saw her experiences as exciting adventures, like something out of a science fiction film. They had no context for understanding what those piloting certifications actually meant: hours of emergency drills, split-second decisions under enemy fire, the responsibility of keeping dozens of lives safe while navigating through asteroid fields or gravitational anomalies. The rest of the math class passed without incident. Sarah helped a few students who were struggling with basic calculus concepts, finding that explaining mathematical principles in simple terms was actually more challenging than applying them in complex situations. It required a different kind of thinking, a patience she wasn't sure she still possessed. AP Physics was similarly comfortable. Mrs. Kumar, the physics teacher, had heard about Sarah's return and had prepared a series of questions about theoretical applications of faster-than-light travel. Sarah found herself discussing Alcubierre drive mechanics and quantum entanglement communication systems with the kind of detail that made her classmates stare at her like she was speaking an alien language. Which, Sarah realized, she sometimes was. 3 years of military service had filled her vocabulary with technical terms, acronyms, and concepts that had no civilian equivalent. She kept catching herself using military jargon and having to translate her thoughts into language her classmates could understand. The real challenge came during third period, current events and galactic politics. Mr. Peterson was a thin, nervous man who'd clearly done extensive research in preparation for Sarah's arrival. His desk was covered with printouts from various news sources, military journals, and academic papers about the war. He prepared what looked like a comprehensive presentation about the conflict, complete with maps of the affected star systems and casualty statistics. Class, he announced as students settled into their seats, today we have the extraordinary opportunity to hear first-hand accounts from someone who served in the Galactic War. Sarah Chen has agreed to share some of her experiences with us. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She hadn't agreed to anything of the sort. Mrs. Patterson had mentioned that Mr. Peterson used her service record as a teaching example, but nobody had told her she'd be expected to perform like a guest speaker at a military history symposium. Actually, Sarah said carefully, I was hoping to just attend class like everyone else. Mr. Peterson's face fell slightly, but he rallied with the determined enthusiasm of a teacher who'd spent hours preparing a lesson plan. Of course, of course. But perhaps you could provide some context for the events we're studying? Your perspective would be invaluable. Sarah glanced around the classroom. 25 faces stared back at her with varying degrees of curiosity, excitement, and expectation. These kids wanted war stories. They wanted tales of heroism and adventure, of good triumphing over evil in the vast expanse of space. They wanted her to be the protagonist of their science fiction fantasies. What would you like to know? Sarah asked, though every instinct screamed at her to deflect the question. A boy named Marcus raised his hand eagerly. Is it true you single-handedly held off an entire Zephyrian assault force? No, Sarah said quickly. I was part of a unit. We worked together. But, the news report said you were alone for most of the battle, insisted a girl named Chloe. They said you fought for 18 hours without backup. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, trying to push away the memory of that day. The sound of plasma fire. The smell of burning equipment. William screaming for a medic after the energy lance tore through his legs. The weight of the rifle in her hands as she fired shot after shot at targets she could barely see through the smoke and chaos. The reports were simplified, she said finally. Military actions are complex. There's usually a lot of confusion, a lot of variables that don't make it into official summaries. But, you did receive the Medal of Galactic Heroism, Mr. Peterson said, consulting his notes. That's only awarded for acts of extraordinary valor in the face of overwhelming odds. Sarah touched her chest unconsciously, feeling the weight of the medal beneath her civilian clothes. She'd earned it, yes, but not in the way these people imagined. There had been no moment of clear-cut heroism, no dramatic speeches about duty and honor. There had only been fear and training and the desperate need to keep her friends alive for one more hour, one more minute, one more second. "I did my job," she said. "Same as everyone else in my unit." The disappointment in the room was palpable. Her classmates had wanted stories of glory and adventure. Instead, they were getting the flat, factual responses of someone who'd learned not to romanticize violence. Mr. Peterson tried a different approach. What was it like, serving alongside alien species? The Centaurans, the Altarians, the Valerians? This was safer territory, Sarah decided. They're just people. Different biology, different cultures, but the same basic needs and motivations as humans. You learn pretty quickly that courage and fear and hope are universal emotions. "Did you learn to speak their languages?" asked Jessica. "Some. Centauran is similar to Mandarin in structure, so that came naturally. Altarian is more challenging, they communicate partly through color changes in their skin, so you have to learn visual cues as well as auditory ones." The questions continued for the rest of the class period, each one requiring Sarah to navigate the gap between what her classmates wanted to hear and what she was willing to share. They wanted excitement and adventure. She could only offer reality, which was messier and more complicated than their expectations. When the bell rang, Sarah felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. Emotional labor, her military psychologist would have called it. The work of managing other people's expectations while protecting your own mental health. Fourth period was art therapy, taught by Ms. Rodriguez in a sunlit room that smelled of paint and clay and the particular combination of creativity and teenage angst. Sarah had never been particularly artistic, but Mrs. Patterson had insisted that creative expression would help with her readjustment process. "Art therapy isn't about being good at art," Ms. Rodriguez explained as she handed Sarah a sketchpad and a box of colored pencils. "It's about finding ways to express feelings and experiences that might be difficult to put into words." Sarah stared at the blank paper for a long time. What feelings was she supposed to express? What experiences could she possibly translate into drawings that wouldn't horrify her teenage classmates? How do you sketch the moment when you realize you've just killed another sentient being? How do you draw the sound of your best friend screaming? Around her, other students worked on their own projects. She could see paintings of flowers and abstract swirls, charcoal drawings of faces and landscapes, clay sculptures that might become bowls or vases or purely decorative objects. Normal teenage art about normal teenage experiences. Finally, Sarah began to sketch. Her hand moved almost without conscious direction, drawing the familiar lines of a ship's control console. The Steadfast, the frigate she'd served on for 2 years, had become as familiar to her as her childhood bedroom. She could navigate its corridors in complete darkness, operate its systems by muscle memory alone. The drawing grew more detailed as she worked. She added the captain's chair where Commander Martinez had made the decisions that kept them all alive. The tactical display where she'd tracked enemy movements during the siege of Proxima. The communication console where she'd received news of victories and defeats, of friends transferred to other units or lost in action. "That's beautiful," said Emma Rodriguez, the student council president who'd greeted her at the shuttle landing. "Is it from a movie or something?" "It's the bridge of the ship I served on," Sarah said without looking up from her drawing. Emma leaned closer to examine the sketch. "It looks so real. Like you could actually operate all those controls." "I could," Sarah said. "I did." The conversation died awkwardly. Emma clearly hadn't expected such a literal answer. Sarah realized she'd done it again, responded with military precision to what was meant to be casual teenage conversation. "I'm sorry," Sarah said quickly. "I'm still adjusting to being back. Sometimes I forget that most people haven't experienced these things." "No, it's okay," Emma said, though her expression suggested otherwise. "It's just hard to imagine, you know? You're our age, but you've done all these incredible things. It makes the rest of us feel kind of small." Sarah looked up from her drawing, surprised. "Small? Why?" "Well, while you were saving the galaxy, we were worried about prom themes and college applications. Our biggest crisis was when the cafeteria stopped serving pizza on Fridays. Emma laughed, but there was something brittle about it. It's hard not to feel like our problems are stupid and insignificant compared to what you've been through. This was the opposite of what Sarah had been feeling. Her classmates' problems seemed beautifully normal to her, delightfully manageable in their scope and simplicity. A college application was a challenge you could prepare for, study for, control. A prom theme was a decision that affected nobody's survival, required no life or death calculations. Your problems aren't stupid, Sarah said carefully. They're just different. Different scale, different stakes, but not less important. Emma smiled, though she still looked uncertain. Thanks. That's nice of you to say. The rest of art therapy passed quietly. Sarah finished her sketch of the Steadfast's bridge, adding small details that nobody else would recognize: the coffee stain on Captain Martinez's armrest, the scratch marks on the tactical display from where Ensign Park had nervous habit of tapping his stylus, the small stuffed animal that Corporal Williams had taped to his console as a good luck charm. By the time she'd finished, the paper was covered with memories that had no place in a high school art class. Fifth period was English literature, which should have been straightforward. Sarah had always been a strong reader, and the Alliance Education Corps had included extensive study of human cultural texts as part of their interspecies communication training. She'd read Shakespeare and Dickens between tactical manuals and xenobiology reports. But Mrs. Franklin's classroom felt like stepping into a time machine. The same motivational posters about the power of reading, the same well-worn copies of classic novels, the same slightly musty smell of old books and teenage indifference. Sarah took a seat in the back row, hoping to observe rather than participate. The class was discussing All Quiet on the Western Front, Remarque's novel about World War I. Mrs. Franklin had clearly chosen the book with Sarah in mind, another well-intentioned attempt to make her feel included by connecting her experiences to familiar literary themes. Paul Baumer's return home on leave, Mrs. Franklin was saying, represents the difficulty soldiers face when trying to reconnect with civilian life. The gap between battlefield reality and domestic normalcy creates a sense of isolation and alienation. A student named David raised his hand. But that was a different kind of war, right? I mean, Sarah's war was in space, fighting aliens. That's completely different from trench warfare. Mrs. Franklin looked hopefully at Sarah. What do you think, Sarah? Do you see any similarities between Paul's experiences and your own? Sarah stared at the open book on her desk, at Remarque's description of a young soldier struggling to reconnect with a world that no longer made sense to him. The specifics were different. Paul fought in muddy trenches while Sarah had fought in the vacuum of space, but the emotional landscape was disturbingly familiar. Distance, Sarah said finally. Physical distance and emotional distance. Paul feels cut off from his family and friends because he can't explain what he's experienced. They can't understand, and he can't find words to bridge that gap. Exactly. Mrs. Franklin said with obvious satisfaction. Literature helps us understand that human experiences transcend specific historical circumstances. The emotions, the psychological challenges, these remain constant. But Sarah wasn't sure that was true. Paul Baumer had fought other humans in a war with clear geographical boundaries and recognizable political objectives. Sarah had fought in a conflict that spanned multiple star systems, alongside species whose biology and psychology were fundamentally alien, in defense of civilizations she'd never seen and people she'd never meet. Paul's war had lasted 4 years and involved millions of soldiers. Sarah's war had lasted 3 years and involved billions of sentient beings across dozens of worlds. The scale was different, the stakes were different, the very nature of identity and belonging was different when you were fighting alongside people who breathed methane and communicated through bioelectric fields. Sarah, said a girl named Alyssa, do you think the book captures what it's really like? Being a soldier, I mean? Sarah considered the question carefully. Remarque had written about fear and exhaustion and the arbitrary nature of survival. He'd captured the way violence became routine, how normal human responses got buried under layers of tactical thinking and emotional numbness. He'd understood that coming home meant grieving for the person you used to be. Some parts, she said. The feeling of not fitting anymore. The way civilian concerns seem She paused, searching for a diplomatic way to express her thoughts. Distant. Remote from what you've learned to worry about. But, you're home now, David said. You're safe. Doesn't that make it easier? Safe. Sarah almost laughed. Earth felt safe in the most literal sense: no enemy fire, no hull breaches, no radiation leaks or hostile boarding parties. But, safety wasn't just about external threats. Safety was about knowing your place in the world, understanding the rules that governed your daily life, feeling confident that you belonged in the space you occupied. Sarah didn't feel safe in any of those ways. She felt like an alien visiting a foreign planet, trying to learn the customs and language of a species she no longer quite belonged to. It's different, she said instead. The discussion continued around her, but Sarah found herself withdrawing into the careful mental distance she'd learned to maintain during debriefings and psychological evaluations. Present but not participating, observant but not engaged. It was a survival mechanism that had served her well in military contexts but felt wrong here, in a classroom full of teenagers discussing literature. The bell rang, ending English and signaling the start of sixth period, physical education. The gymnasium was exactly as Sarah remembered it: polished wooden floors, basketball hoops at either end, that distinctive smell of sweat and floor wax and industrial cleaning products. Coach Williams, still no relation to her friend, was a compact, energetic woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a fitness magazine. "Shun," Coach Williams called as Sarah entered the locker room. "Great to have you back. I understand you've got some advanced training under your belt." Sarah changed into the borrowed gym clothes her mother had packed, hyper-aware of how different her body had become over the past 3 years. The soft curves of adolescence had been replaced by the lean muscle mass of someone who'd spent 3 years in variable gravity environments. Scars crossed her arms and torso, souvenirs of shrapnel, energy burns, and one memorable encounter with a Zephyrian blade weapon. Her classmates noticed, of course. She caught them staring when they thought she wasn't looking, whispering to each other about the evidence of violence written across her skin. Sarah had grown used to her scars during military service, where everyone carried similar markers of their experiences. Here, surrounded by unmarked teenage bodies, she felt like a freak show exhibit. "All right, everyone," Coach Williams announced as the class gathered in the gymnasium. "Today we're doing fitness assessments. Standard tests, push-ups, sit-ups, mile run, flexibility measurements." The assessments were almost laughably easy. 3 years of military conditioning had left Sarah capable of physical feats that seemed impossible to her classmates. She completed 50 push-ups before most of them had managed 10. Her mile time was fast enough to qualify for competitive track teams. Her flexibility and balance were exceptional, trained by countless hours of zero-gravity maneuvering. But, instead of feeling proud of her achievements, Sarah felt increasingly isolated. Each test widened the gap between her and her classmates, made her seem more alien and less relatable. "Have you considered trying out for track?" Coach Williams asked as Sarah finished her assessments. "With times like these, you could probably get a full scholarship to any college in the country." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not really interested in competitive sports." "Why not?" "You've obviously got the natural talent and the training." How could she explain that competitive sports felt frivolous after 3 years of combat? That running fast was only useful if you were running towards something important or away from something dangerous? That physical excellence without tactical purpose seemed like an empty exercise? "I've got other priorities," she said instead. The walk home from school took Sarah through the same neighborhood she'd traversed thousands of times as a child. Past the corner store where she'd bought candy with pocket money, past the park where she'd learned to ride a bicycle, past the houses of friends whose names she could barely remember now. Everything was smaller than she remembered. The distances that had seemed vast during childhood took only minutes to traverse. The problems that had loomed large in her adolescent imagination, tests, social drama, college preparation, seemed manageable to the point of triviality. But her own house, when she finally reached it, felt like a sanctuary. Her parents were working at the restaurant, leaving Sarah alone with the familiar silence of an empty home. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom and sat on the edge of her childhood bed, staring at the drawing she'd made in art therapy. The steadfast bridge stared back at her from the paper, rendered in careful detail that captured not just the visual elements but something of the emotional weight the space had carried. This was where she'd felt competent, useful, important. This was where she'd belonged. Her communicator chimed softly, a small device she'd been allowed to keep from her military service, designed to receive messages from other Alliance personnel. Sarah opened the message eagerly, hoping for word from her unit. It was from Williams, still recovering in the medical facility on Proxima Station. "Hey Lieutenant," the message read. "How's civilian life treating you? Hospital food is terrible, but the physical therapy is going well. Might be walking again sooner than the doctors predicted. Miss having you around to keep me from going crazy. Hope Earth is everything you remembered. Stay in touch." Sarah stared at the message for a long time. Williams was facing months more of painful rehabilitation, learning to use prosthetic limbs, rebuilding his life around new physical limitations. But his message was cheerful, optimistic, focused on recovery and future possibilities. Meanwhile, Sarah was struggling to survive a single day of high school. She typed back, "Civilian life is an adjustment. Glad to hear about your progress. Let me know if you need anything. Keep fighting. SC." But, as she sent the message, Sarah wondered if she was the one who needed encouragement. Williams was recovering from war wounds in a military hospital, surrounded by people who understood his experiences and supported his healing. Sarah was living in her childhood bedroom, trying to pretend she was still the person who'd left 3 years ago. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through social media, looking at posts from her former classmates. Photos from parties she hadn't attended, updates about college applications and part-time jobs and relationship drama. Normal teenage concerns from normal teenage lives. 3 years ago, these updates would have been fascinating to her. She would have felt connected to this web of social relationships, invested in the small dramas and victories of her peer group. Now, reading about someone's anxiety over a calculus test or excitement about a new romantic relationship, Sarah felt like an anthropologist studying a culture she no longer understood. These problems were real and important to the people experiencing them, but they existed in a completely different universe from the one Sarah now inhabited. Her parents came home while she was doing homework, filling the house with the familiar sounds and smells of their evening routine. They asked about her first day back, and Sarah gave them the kind of positive, reassuring answers they needed to hear. School was fine. Her classmates were welcoming. Her teachers were supportive. Everything was going smoothly. She didn't mention the way her math classmates had stared at her like she was a performing animal. She didn't talk about the uncomfortable questions in current events, or the way her artwork had captured memories that had no place in a high school art room. She didn't describe the isolation she'd felt in the locker room, or the way her physical abilities had set her apart from her peers. Her parents needed to believe that their daughter was successfully readjusting to normal life. Sarah needed to believe it too. But, sitting in her childhood bedroom that night, surrounded by posters and memories from a person she used to be, Sarah wondered if successful readjustment was actually possible. Maybe the girl who'd left for war 3 years ago was gone forever. Maybe the person who'd returned was someone new, someone who would never quite fit into the life that had been waiting for her. Maybe coming home wasn't about returning to who you used to be. Maybe it was about figuring out who you were going to become. But, that night, as Sarah lay in bed listening to the too quiet sounds of Earth, she wasn't sure she was ready for that kind of transformation. She wasn't sure she had the energy to become a new person when she was still grieving for the old one. 2 weeks into her return, Sarah established a routine that felt like a careful negotiation between who she used to be and who she'd become. Morning runs at 5 a.m. when the streets were empty and she didn't have to moderate her pace for civilian expectations. Advanced classes where her enhanced education gave her confidence and purpose. Lunch periods spent in the library, avoiding the social complexities of the cafeteria. The routine worked until the morning she found Tyler Morrison crying in the hallway outside the chemistry lab. Sarah almost walked past him. Tyler was 2 years younger than her, a sophomore she barely remembered from her previous life at Lincoln High. He sat hunched against a row of lockers, textbooks scattered around him like debris from some academic catastrophe. His shoulders shook with the kind of quiet desperation that Sarah recognized from military hospitals and casualty reports. Something in his posture stopped her. The way he held his head, the careful control of his breathing, the attempt to make himself invisible while falling apart, it reminded her of young soldiers trying to process trauma they weren't equipped to handle. "Tyler," she said softly, crouching down to his eye level. "What's wrong?" Tyler looked up with red-rimmed eyes that held the kind of panic Sarah had seen in new recruits during their first combat engagement. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered. "I can't keep pretending everything's okay." Sarah glanced around the empty hallway, calculating. First period wouldn't start for another 20 minutes. They had time to talk without drawing attention from other students. She settled onto the floor beside Tyler, close enough to offer comfort but far enough away to avoid crowding him. "Tell me what's happening," she said. The story came out in fragments. Tyler's parents were getting divorced, a messy, bitter separation that had turned their house into a war zone. His mother worked 3 jobs to pay for lawyers and rent. His father had moved across the county and stopped calling. Tyler was failing chemistry because he couldn't concentrate on homework when his parents were screaming at each other through their lawyers. He was losing weight because meals had become irregular and tense. He was losing sleep because his bedroom shared a wall with his mother's, and he could hear her crying every night. "Everyone keeps saying I need to focus on my education, that I can't let my parents' problems affect my future," Tyler said. "But I can't think about college when my mom can barely afford groceries. I can't care about test scores when our house might get foreclosed next month." Sarah listened without offering platitudes or easy solutions. Tyler's problems weren't the kind that could be fixed with better study habits or positive thinking. They were systemic, complex, rooted in adult failures that had cascaded down to affect a kid who'd done nothing wrong except be born into a family that was falling apart. "Have you talked to anyone about this?" Sarah asked. "A counselor, a teacher, someone who might be able to help?" Tyler laughed bitterly. "Mrs. Patterson keeps telling me to compartmentalize. She says I need to separate my home life from my academic performance. Mr. Chen, my chemistry teacher, thinks I'm just lazy. He keeps talking about how important it is to take responsibility for my own success." Sarah felt anger building in her chest, the familiar heat that had sustained her through 3 years of combat. But this wasn't enemy fire or tactical incompetence she was angry about. This was a system that expected a 15-year-old boy to function normally while his entire world collapsed around him. Adults who responded to a child's crisis with lectures about personal responsibility and time management. "What do you need?" Sarah asked. "Right now, today, what would actually help?" Tyler stared at her like the question had never occurred to him. "I don't know. Nobody's ever asked me that before." Sarah thought about the leadership training she'd received in the Alliance military. Crisis management, resource allocation, tactical assessment under pressure. The skills that had helped her keep her unit functional during the siege of Kepler 442b weren't so different from what Tyler needed now. "Okay," she said. "Let's break this down into manageable pieces. You're failing chemistry because you can't study at home. Where else could you study? I guess, the library? But it closes at 6, and I have to get home to make sure my mom's okay. What about school library? Does it stay open after hours? Until 7 on weekdays. But I don't have a way to get home after that. My mom works until 9, and the buses stop running." Sarah nodded, filing away the information. Transportation was solvable. Study space was solvable. The emotional weight Tyler was carrying would be harder to address, but academic success might give him something positive to focus on. "I could help you with chemistry," she said. "I tested out of it during my Alliance training, and I'm pretty good at breaking down complex concepts into simple steps." Tyler looked at her with something that might have been hope. "You'd do that? Why?" Sarah considered the question. Why was she offering to help a boy she barely knew? Was it because she recognized the signs of someone drowning in circumstances beyond their control? Because she understood what it felt like to have adults expect you to function normally while carrying impossible burdens? Because helping Tyler gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing from her carefully structured routine? "Because you need help," she said simply. "And I can provide it." They arranged to meet in the library after school 3 times a week. Tyler would work on his chemistry assignments while Sarah tutored him through the concepts he'd missed. Sarah would drive him home afterward. She'd gotten her license reinstated the previous week, along with driving privileges for her father's old sedan. The first tutoring session revealed the extent of Tyler's academic crisis. He wasn't just struggling with chemistry, he was drowning in all of his classes, overwhelmed by assignments that had piled up while he dealt with his family's disintegration. Sarah found herself expanding their sessions to cover basic organizational skills, time management, and study techniques. "You're really good at this," Tyler said during their third meeting, looking up from a chemistry worksheet he'd just completed successfully. "Have you thought about becoming a teacher?" Sarah paused, considering the question. Teaching hadn't occurred to her as a possibility, but she was discovering that she enjoyed breaking down complex problems into manageable steps. She liked helping Tyler build confidence in his own abilities, watching him develop skills that would serve him beyond high school chemistry. "Maybe," she said. "I hadn't really thought about what comes next." That was true in more ways than Tyler could know. Sarah had spent 3 years focused on immediate survival, short-term tactical objectives, and the mission requirements of active military service. Long-term career planning felt like a luxury she hadn't been able to afford. Coming home was supposed to have opened up those possibilities again, but instead she felt more directionless than ever. The Alliance had offered her a full scholarship to any university in their network, along with accelerated officer training programs that would fast-track her to command positions. She could be a starship captain by the time she turned 25, commanding mixed-species crews on deep space missions. The military had made it clear that they wanted her back, that her service record and leadership potential made her valuable to the Alliance war effort. But the idea of returning to military service, even in peacetime operations, felt wrong in a way Sarah couldn't quite articulate. She'd given 3 years of her life to the war effort. She'd earned her medals and her rank and the respect of colleagues who trusted her with their lives. But she'd also paid a price that went deeper than physical scars or PTSD symptoms. She'd lost something essential during those 3 years, some sense of optimism or innocence or hope that couldn't be recovered through therapy or time. She'd seen what people were capable of doing to each other when resources grew scarce and survival became uncertain. She'd learned that the universe was vast and hostile and largely indifferent to human concerns. Working with Tyler was the first time since her return that Sarah had felt useful in a way that aligned with her values. Helping him succeed in chemistry wasn't going to save the galaxy or prevent interstellar conflicts, but it was making a real difference in one person's life. It was building something positive instead of destroying enemy assets. Their tutoring relationship expanded beyond academics. Tyler began confiding in Sarah about his family situation, and Sarah found herself offering the kind of practical advice she'd learned from managing resources during military crises. Budgeting techniques her unit had used during supply shortages. Stress management strategies that had helped soldiers maintain mental health during extended combat deployments. Communication skills for dealing with authority figures who might not have your best interests at heart. "My mom wants to meet you," Tyler said one afternoon as they packed up their study materials. "She keeps asking about the person who's been helping me get my grades up." Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety. Meeting Tyler's mother felt like crossing a line from helpful classmate to actual involvement in his family situation. But Tyler's grades had improved dramatically over the past month, and his general demeanor had shifted from quiet desperation to cautious optimism. If meeting his mother was part of continuing to help him, Sarah was willing to make that commitment. Tyler's house was a small ranch-style home in one of the older neighborhoods near the school. The yard needed work, and the paint was peeling around the windows, but it was clean and well-maintained despite the obvious financial constraints. Tyler's mother, Janet Morrison, met them at the front door with a tired smile that reminded Sarah of her own mother during the restaurant's busiest seasons. "You must be Sarah," Janet said, extending her hand. "Tyler talks about you constantly. I can't thank you enough for what you've done for him." "He's doing the work," Sarah said. "I'm just providing some structure and support." Janet invited Sarah inside for coffee, and Sarah found herself sitting in a living room that showed signs of recent upheaval. Boxes were stacked in one corner, labeled with the careful handwriting of someone preparing for an uncertain future. A stack of legal documents sat on the coffee table, held down by a coffee mug that had seen better days. I know Tyler's told you about the divorce, Janet said, settling into a chair across from Sarah. It's been hard on him, harder than I realized until his grades started slipping. I'd been so focused on keeping us financially afloat that I missed how much he was struggling emotionally. Sarah glanced at Tyler, who was organizing his backpack with the kind of careful attention that suggested he didn't want to participate in this conversation. He's dealing with a lot of stress that most kids his age don't have to handle. But he's resilient, and he's developing good coping strategies. That's what I don't understand, Janet said. Where did those strategies come from? Tyler was falling apart 2 months ago, and now he's organized, focused, confident. His teachers say he's like a different student. What did you do? Sarah considered how to explain 3 years of military training in leadership and crisis management without alarming a civilian parent. I helped him break down his problems into manageable pieces. A lot of stress comes from feeling overwhelmed by the scope of challenges you're facing. If you can identify specific, actionable steps toward improvement, the problems become less intimidating. Are you planning to study psychology in college? Education, maybe? I'm not sure yet, Sarah said honestly. I'm still figuring out what direction I want my life to take. Janet studied Sarah with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was seeing more than Sarah intended to reveal. Tyler mentioned that you served in the military. The Galactic War? Sarah nodded, bracing herself for the usual questions about heroism and adventure. Instead, Janet's expression grew thoughtful. That must have been difficult, coming back to civilian life. Especially at your age. It's an adjustment, Sarah said carefully. I imagine so. Tyler's father is a veteran Desert Storm, back in the 90s. He had trouble readjusting when he came home, even though his deployment was only 8 months. I can't imagine what 3 years would do to someone, especially someone who'd left as a teenager. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. Janet wasn't asking for war stories or treating Sarah like a celebrity. She was acknowledging the difficulty of transition, the real challenges of readjustment that most people either ignored or romanticized. Sometimes it feels like I'm two different people, Sarah said quietly. The person who left and the person who came back. I'm still trying to figure out how to reconcile those identities. Maybe you don't have to, Janet suggested. Maybe the goal isn't to go back to who you were before, but to integrate your experiences into whoever you're becoming. The conversation continued for another hour, ranging from practical matters like Tyler's academic progress to deeper questions about identity, purpose, and the challenges of building a meaningful life after trauma. Sarah found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected, sharing thoughts and concerns she'd been keeping carefully contained since her return. When she finally left Tyler's house, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since coming home, a sense of connection with another human being who understood her situation without needing detailed explanations or military context. That night, she called Williams at the medical facility on Proxima Station. Lieutenant. Williams answered with his usual cheerfulness. How's life on the home front? Complicated, Sarah said, settling onto her bed with her feet tucked under her. I've been helping one of my classmates with his studies. Kid named Tyler who's been dealing with some family stress. Tutoring, huh? That's very humanitarian of you. What's he studying? Chemistry mostly, but it's expanded into general academic support. Organization skills, time management, stress reduction techniques. Williams was quiet for a moment. Sounds like you're using your leadership training in a civilian context. How does it feel? Good, Sarah said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Really good. Like I'm using my skills for something constructive instead of destructive. Have you thought about making it official? Teacher training, educational psychology, that kind of thing? Sarah had been thinking about exactly that, though she hadn't articulated it clearly until Williams asked the question. Working with Tyler had shown her that her military training had applications beyond combat situations. Leadership, crisis management, resource allocation, strategic thinking, all of these skills were valuable in civilian contexts, especially in education and social services. Maybe, she said. The Alliance Scholarship would cover education programs. I could study at any university in the network. But? Williams prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice. But, I'm not sure I want to leave Earth again. I just got back. My family's here, and Tyler's making real progress. I feel like I'm finally starting to figure out how to live in this world. Williams was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. You know, the best officers I've served with were the ones who understood that leadership isn't about commanding troops or winning battles. It's about taking care of people, helping them become the best versions of themselves. Sounds like you're already doing that. After they ended the call, Sarah lay in bed thinking about Williams's words. Leadership as service, as helping people develop their potential, as creating conditions for others to succeed. She'd learned those principles in military contexts, but maybe they applied equally well to civilian life. The next morning, Sarah made an appointment with Mrs. Patterson to discuss her post-graduation plans. The guidance counselor's office felt different now, less like a place where she was forced to pretend everything was fine, more like a resource she could use to build a future that actually aligned with her values and interests. Education? Mrs. Patterson said, reviewing Sarah's preliminary college application materials. That's wonderful, Sarah. Have you thought about what grade level you'd like to teach? High school, I think. Maybe focusing on students who are dealing with crisis situations. Kids who are struggling with more than just academic challenges. Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. There's a real need for teachers who understand trauma and stress management. Your military background would be valuable in that context, not because of the combat experience, but because of the leadership and crisis management training. They spent an hour discussing program options, application deadlines, and the specific requirements for education degrees. Sarah learned about accelerated programs for veterans, specialized tracks in crisis counseling and trauma-informed education, and research opportunities in military-to-civilian transition support. For the first time since her return, Sarah felt excited about her future. Not the generic excitement of having options, but the specific enthusiasm that came from identifying a path that felt both challenging and meaningful. That afternoon, during her tutoring session with Tyler, Sarah mentioned her college plans. Education? Tyler looked up from his chemistry homework with genuine interest. That makes sense. You're really good at explaining things so they make sense. Are you going to stay local, or go somewhere far away? I'm thinking about staying in-state, Sarah said. There are some good programs here, and I like the idea of being close to home. Tyler nodded, then returned to his homework with the kind of focused attention that had replaced his earlier academic panic. Watching him work, Sarah felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with academic achievement or military recognition. Tyler was succeeding because she'd helped him develop tools and strategies that would serve him long after their tutoring sessions ended. This was what Williams had been talking about. Leadership as service, as empowerment, as creating conditions for others to thrive. Sarah had spent 3 years learning to make life and death decisions under pressure. Now she was learning to make life-giving decisions under normal circumstances. The transition from military to civilian life wasn't about returning to who she used to be. It was about becoming someone new, someone who could integrate her experiences into a purpose that served both her own healing and the welfare of others. For the first time since coming home, Sarah Chen felt like she knew who she was becoming. And she liked the person she saw emerging from the integration of her past experiences and her present opportunities. The crisis began on a Tuesday morning in November, when Sarah arrived at school to find emergency vehicles surrounding the building and students huddled in small groups on the front lawn. Police cars, ambulances, and what looked like a hazmat response team had turned Lincoln High's parking lot into a disaster scene straight out of Sarah's military nightmares. Principal Morrison stood near the main entrance, his face pale and drawn, speaking rapidly into his phone while gesturing at the emergency responders. Sarah caught fragments of his conversation as she approached unknown substance. Evacuation protocols. Potential contamination. Sarah. Tyler's voice cut through the chaos. He jogged toward her from a group of sophomores clustered near the flagpole, his face tight with anxiety. Something happened in the chemistry lab. They won't tell us what, but they evacuated the whole science wing and called in the hazmat team. Sarah's military training kicked in automatically, her mind shifting into crisis assessment mode. She scanned the emergency response setup, noting the positioning of vehicles, the equipment being deployed, and the behavior of the first responders. This wasn't a routine evacuation drill or a minor chemical spill. The hazmat team's presence suggested serious contamination risk, possibly involving toxic or corrosive substances. "Where's Mr. Chan?" Sarah asked, referring to Tyler's chemistry teacher. "They took him to the hospital about 20 minutes ago." And 3 students from first period chemistry. Emma Rodriguez was one of them. Sarah felt her stomach clench. Emma, the student council president who'd welcomed her home with glitter banners and nervous enthusiasm. Emma, who'd worried that her problems seemed small compared to Sarah's war experiences. Emma, who'd been trying so hard to make Sarah feel included and valued. "What happened to them?" Sarah asked. "Nobody knows for sure. But Amanda Price was in the hallway when they brought Emma out, and she said Emma couldn't breathe properly. Like, gasping and wheezing, and her lips were blue." Chemical exposure, Sarah thought immediately. Respiratory distress suggested inhalation of toxic fumes, possibly chlorine gas or ammonia compounds. Both were common in high school chemistry labs, and both could cause severe respiratory damage if concentrations were high enough. "Do they know what caused the exposure?" Sarah asked. Tyler shook his head. "Principal Morrison isn't saying much. Just that there was an incident in the lab and they're investigating." Sarah studied the emergency response more carefully. The hazmat team was setting up a decontamination station near the science wing entrance, which meant they expected potentially contaminated individuals to be coming out of the building. But they weren't rushing, which suggested the immediate danger had passed. This was containment and cleanup, not active rescue. A flash of movement near the school side entrance caught Sarah's attention. Dr. Martinez, the school's part-time nurse, was wheeling a portable oxygen tank toward one of the ambulances. Her movements were efficient but hurried, suggesting ongoing medical emergencies. "Tyler," Sarah said, making a decision that felt both necessary and dangerous, "I need you to do exactly what I tell you, okay? No questions, no arguments." "Can you do that?" Tyler nodded, though his expression suggested he was already worried about what Sarah might ask him to do. "Find Mrs. Patterson and tell her that someone with chemical emergency training is available to assist if needed. Don't mention my military background specifically, just say that a student with relevant experience is willing to help." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to see if there's anything useful I can contribute to the response effort." Sarah approached the incident command post that the fire department had established near the main parking lot. The incident commander, a middle-aged woman with the calm, focused demeanor Sarah recognized from military leadership, was coordinating between multiple agencies while consulting what looked like emergency response protocols on a tablet. "Excuse me," Sarah said, waiting for a pause in the radio chatter. "I'm a student here, but I have chemical emergency training from my military service. Is there anything I can help with?" The incident commander looked up, studying Sarah with the kind of quick assessment that experienced emergency responders use to evaluate potential assets and liabilities. "What kind of training?" 3 years Alliance military, including hazmat response certification and field medical training. I've handled chemical exposure incidents in combat environments." The woman's expression shifted slightly, from polite dismissal to cautious interest. "Alliance military? What's your rank?" "Lieutenant Sarah Chan, inactive reserve status." "Commander Patricia Hayes, Lincoln Fire Department." Hayes extended her hand with the firm grip of someone who'd earned her authority through experience rather than politics. "What can you tell me about the incident?" Sarah glanced toward the school building, organizing her thoughts. "From what I observed, you have contained contamination in the chemistry lab, probable inhalation exposure for multiple individuals, respiratory distress as the primary symptom. The hazmat team's setup suggests ongoing decontamination rather than active rescue, which means the source has been identified and neutralized." Hayes nodded approvingly. "Close." Chemistry teacher was demonstrating a reaction involving hydrogen sulfide generation. Equipment malfunction caused a much larger release than intended, filled the classroom with toxic gas. Teacher and 3 students caught the worst of it before he could get them evacuated. Hydrogen sulfide. Sarah's memory pulled up everything she'd learned about the gas during her chemical warfare training. Highly toxic even in small concentrations, causing respiratory distress, neurological symptoms, and potential cardiac arrest at high exposures. But also relatively short-lived in open air, which explained why the hazmat team wasn't rushing. What's the exposure severity? Sarah asked. Unknown. The teacher lost consciousness briefly, which suggests pretty high concentration. The students were conscious but having breathing difficulties. We've got them on oxygen and transported to regional medical for evaluation. Sarah nodded, her mind running through treatment protocols and potential complications. Are you planning to clear the rest of the building for potential residual contamination? That's what we're working on now. The gas should have dissipated, but we want to test air quality in adjacent classrooms before we let anyone back in. Do you need additional personnel for air quality testing? I'm certified for atmospheric monitoring in enclosed spaces. Hayes considered this for a moment. Normally I'd say no liability issues with civilian volunteers. But, if you're military trained and we're short-handed. She glanced at her tablet, then at the hazmat team still setting up their equipment. Let me check with my chief. While Hayes consulted with the fire chief, Sarah watched the continuing emergency response. Students were being kept at a safe distance, but she could see the anxiety and confusion on their faces. This wasn't the kind of crisis teenagers were equipped to handle: the uncertainty, the potential danger, the sight of classmates being taken away in ambulances. Tyler appeared at her elbow. Mrs. Patterson says thank you for offering to help, and Principal Morrison wants to talk to you when you have a minute. What does he?